The House Rules Committee hearing room buzzed with quiet tension, the kind that hums just before a storm breaks. Former Speaker Kevin McCarthy, seated at the witness table, had been testifying with the practiced ease of a man long accustomed to power. For 15 straight minutes, Representative Jasmine Crockett had been pressing him, precise, steady, and unrelenting, questioning discrepancies between his current testimony and his past record on budget reform. McCarthy leaned forward abruptly, cutting her off mid-sentence. His voice, firm but rising, filled the chamber. "Representative Crockett," he said sharply, "I've indulged your politically motivated interrogation long enough. This performance might play well on television, but I was Speaker of the House. I understand the budgeting process far better than a freshman member who's barely been here long enough to find the restrooms." A few committee members shifted uneasily, their expressions betraying discomfort. The chairman, Tom Cole, glanced toward his gavel, clearly weighing whether to intervene. The air thickened. For a heartbeat, Crockett didn't move. Her face betrayed nothing. No anger, no irritation, only the stillness of calculation. Then, calmly, she reached for her microphone and delivered a single, perfectly measured line that froze every reporter's fingers above their keyboards. "Mr. McCarthy," she began, her tone cool and precise, "the congressional record shows that when you were a freshman representative in 2007, you proposed the exact same budget transparency amendment I'm supporting today, the one you just described as dangerous to congressional operations. So my question isn't about my experience versus yours. It's about why you've abandoned the principles you once fought for." The silence that followed was absolute. McCarthy's expression faltered, his jaw tightening. Around the room, committee members straightened in their seats, rifling through binders to verify her statement. Chairman Cole cleared his throat and busied himself with his water glass, suddenly avoiding the former speaker's gaze. "Before we dissect this remarkable clash between Congress's past and its rising present, don't forget to subscribe and share where you're watching from, because this is one political exchange you'll want to understand in full." Representative Jasmine Crockett had built her reputation in Washington not through theatrics, but through discipline and detail. A former civil rights attorney with a background in administrative law, she had brought to Congress the same meticulous energy that once defined her courtroom work. Before winning her seat, she'd served as special counsel to the Texas Legislature's Appropriations Committee, gaining a deep understanding of budget transparency and procedural reform experience that would later make her one of the most informed voices in federal fiscal oversight. "Effective oversight isn't about partisanship," she often said on the campaign trail. "It's about principle. Transparency and accountability should never depend on who's holding the gavel." At 42, Crockett's preparation was legendary. She read every line of legislation herself, annotated historical precedents, and entered hearings with facts no staffer could have summarized better. She wasn't there for headlines. She was there for precision, and it showed. Across the aisle sat Kevin McCarthy, a man whose political journey had followed a very different path. From the California State Assembly to the highest office in the House, McCarthy's rise had been fueled by relationships, negotiation, and strategic agility. In his 16 years in Congress, he had participated in countless budget showdowns, from shutdowns to debt-ceiling standoffs, honing a reputation as both tactician and survivor. Even after his dramatic ousting as Speaker through a historic motion to vacate, McCarthy had kept himself in the spotlight, giving interviews and think tank speeches on fiscal policy and governance. This appearance, his first formal testimony since leaving the speakership, it was meant to reassert his voice as an elder statesman of Congress. Hearing itself centered on H.R. 4217, the Congressional Budget Transparency Act, a sweeping reform bill designed to increase public visibility into congressional budgeting. The act mandated open disclosure of all negotiation sessions, required a 72-hour public review window for every appropriations bill, and prohibited last-minute legislative add-ons, provisions McCarthy now dismissed as impractical. That position, however, stood in striking contrast to his earlier record, a contrast Crockett had spent weeks preparing to expose. At precisely 10 a.m., Chairman Tom Cole struck his gavel. "This hearing will now come to order. Today, the committee will examine H.R. 4217, the Congressional Budget Transparency Act. We welcome our first witness, former Speaker Kevin McCarthy." McCarthy's confidence filled the room as he began. His voice carried the ease of long experience, smooth, deliberate, authoritative. "While the intent behind these reforms may be noble," he said, "the reality of budget negotiation requires flexibility. Confidential discussions allow members to strike compromises without immediate political backlash. Mandating full transparency sounds appealing, but in practice, it paralyzes the process. It doesn't fix gridlock. It worsens it. He recounted stories from his tenure as Speaker. Late-night negotiations, razor-thin deadlines, near shutdowns narrowly averted. The 72-hour public review period, he argued, would turn urgency into chaos. I've lived through it. These deadlines demand adaptability, not rigid rules. For a while, his words commanded respect. Several senior members nodded, echoing his concerns about procedural rigidity. The tone was collegial, deferential. That changed when Representative Crockett's name was called. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her tone even and respectful. "Mr. McCarthy, thank you for your testimony. I'd like to discuss what appears to be a shift in your perspective on budget transparency." She opened a thick binder marked with color-coded tabs and flipped to a highlighted section. In 2007, during your first term in Congress, you co-sponsored H.R. 2989, which required a 72-hour public review period for all appropriations bills, almost identical to what H.R. 4217 proposes today. Could you help us understand what experiences or insights led you to reverse your stance? The question, direct and documented, landed with precision. McCarthy's practiced smile stiffened slightly. "Well," he began carefully, "congressional processes are more complicated than they appear from the outside. Over time, my responsibilities, particularly as Speaker, gave me new perspective. What seems straightforward at the start of one's career often becomes nuanced when you're responsible for running the entire institution." "I understand positions can evolve," Crockett replied smoothly, "but I'm curious about the specific turning point. In 2018, as Majority Leader, you condemned omnibus spending bills that were rushed to the floor without sufficient review. You said, and I quote, 'Ramming 1,000-page spending bills through Congress without transparency undermines democracy.'" She pressed a button, and McCarthy's own quote appeared on the screen behind her. "That statement aligns perfectly with H.R. 4217's transparency provision. What happened between 2018 and today that convinced you such transparency is now a threat?" The atmosphere shifted palpably. McCarthy's reply came slower this time. "Context matters, Representative. Those comments referred to specific legislative circumstances. As Speaker, I work to balance transparency with the need to keep the government running." Crockett leaned forward slightly. "I appreciate that governance involves balance, but since we're discussing context, in 2020, you cited last-minute amendments to budget bills as, and I quote, 'one of Washington's most corrupt habits.' Section 4 of this bill explicitly bans those last-minute changes, yet you've testified today that such restrictions would hamstring flexibility." She paused, letting her words settle. "So, Mr. McCarthy, could you provide a concrete example from your time as Speaker where a last-minute addition was both necessary and beyond public scrutiny?" The question, again documented with McCarthy's own statements, continued the pattern of highlighting specific inconsistencies between his past advocacy and current testimony. Several committee members were now paying closer attention, some reviewing the materials in their binders. McCarthy's response became more pointed. "Representative, cherry-picking statements without the full legislative context misrepresents my consistent commitment to responsible governance. During my leadership, I maintained transparency while facing unprecedented challenges, including pandemic response and avoiding government shutdowns." "I'm not questioning your commitment to governance," Crockett clarified. "I'm trying to understand the specific experiences that changed your position on these procedural reforms." She turned to another document. "In fact, during floor debate on the CARES Act in 2020, you stated that emergency situations are precisely when transparency matters most, because rushed legislation risks costly mistakes and unintended consequences. That principle seems directly contradicted by your testimony today." This third documented contradiction, again using McCarthy's own words, visibly frustrated the former Speaker. His response took on a sharper edge. "With respect, representative statements made during specific legislative debates addressed particular circumstances. My testimony today reflects comprehensive experience leading the House through complex funding challenges. The simplified characterization you're presenting fails to capture the nuanced reality of congressional budgeting." "I understand nuance is important," Crockett responded. "That's why I'm asking about specific provisions, rather than general principles." She turned to Section 6 of the bill. This provision would require public disclosure of all participants in budget negotiations. In 2010, you criticized backroom deals made by unknown participants as undermining public trust. Yet today you testified this disclosure requirement would chill necessary preliminary discussions. What specific experience as Speaker demonstrated the need for undisclosed negotiation participants? This fourth documented inconsistency, following the same pattern of using McCarthy's own statements, created a palpable tension in the hearing room. The former Speaker's expression tightened as he responded again. Representative, you're selectively citing past statements without acknowledging the practical realities of governance. Budget negotiations often involve preliminary discussions where participants need space to explore potential compromises before formal positions are established. Complete transparency at all stages would actually reduce accountability by pushing real decisions into even less formal channels. Crockett nodded thoughtfully. That's a substantive response about negotiation dynamics. I'm wondering if you can identify when your understanding of these dynamics changed, given that in 2015, you stated that knowing who was in the room during budget negotiations is fundamental to democratic accountability. Was there a specific experience that demonstrated the problems with negotiation transparency? The persistent documented comparison between McCarthy's past statements and current testimony was visibly frustrating the former Speaker. Several committee members were now actively following the exchange, some reviewing documents that appeared to contain McCarthy's historical statements on budget procedures. McCarthy's response took on an increasingly defensive tone. My experience leading the House provided comprehensive understanding of how theoretical transparency mandates can undermine practical governance. When you've actually had to negotiate spending agreements under deadline pressure with divided government, you gain insights that aren't apparent from the outside. I appreciate leadership experience provides valuable perspective, Crockett acknowledged. I'm trying to understand the specific insights that changed your position on these particular provisions. She turned to another document. During your Speaker campaign, you promised to end the practice of belied, massive omnibus bills assembled in secret and rushed to the floor. Section 2 of H.R. 40217 would codify exactly that commitment into standing rules. What specific experience during your speakership demonstrated that this commitment was impractical? This fifth documented contradiction between McCarthy's past positions and current testimony created an unmistakable pattern that even casual observers could recognize. The former Speaker's frustration appeared to reach a breaking point, leading him to interrupt Crockett mid-quest. Representative Crockett, McCarthy interjected, his voice rising as he leaned toward his microphone. I've sat patiently through your politically motivated questioning. But this charade has gone far enough. I was Speaker of the House. I understand congressional budgeting better than a freshman representative who's barely been here long enough to find the restrooms. Perhaps if you spent less time on television and more time learning how Congress actually works. Committee members shifted uncomfortably at this personal attack. Chairman Cole glanced at his gavel, clearly considering intervention. For 3 seconds, Crockett remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable as she studied the former Speaker. When she finally spoke, her voice remained measured but carried unmistakable precision. Mr. McCarthy, she said, the congressional record shows that when you were a freshman representative in 2007, you proposed the exact same budget transparency amendment I'm supporting today. The very one you just testified would fundamentally damage congressional operations. So my question isn't about my experience versus yours, but why you've abandoned the principles you once championed. Their response focused entirely on documented substance, rather than returning the personal attack created absolute silence in the hearing room. Several committee members visibly reacted, some exchanging glances of surprise, others quickly reviewing their notes. Chairman Cole, recognizing the significance of the exchange, intervened smoothly. I appreciate the robust discussion of these important procedural questions. Let's take a 5-minute recess before continuing with questions from other members. As members filed out for the break, the dynamic of the hearing had fundamentally changed. What began as routine testimony had transformed into a defining moment that committee staffers would later describe as the day institutional memory met institutional accountability. When the hearing resumed after recess, the impact of the exchange between Crockett and McCarthy was immediately apparent. Committee members who had previously directed differential questions to the former Speaker now approached their questioning with noticeably greater specificity and historical context. Representative Davis, a senior committee member, reflected this shift in his questioning. Mr. McCarthy, I'd like to follow up on the historical perspective Representative Crockett raised. You've served through several different budget process reforms. Could you address more specifically how your position on public review periods evolve based on practical experience rather than political circumstances? This question focused on substantive evolution rather than deferring to McCarthy's authority, indicated that Crockett's approach had shifted the committee's entire frame of reference. McCarthy's response attempted to recover his position while acknowledging the documented history. Thank you for that question, Representative Davis. My position has evolved based on seeing how theoretical reforms function in practice. While I still believe in transparency as a principle, experience showed that rigid procedural mandates often create unintended consequences. For example, during the 2018 appropriations cycle, the 72-hour review requirement nearly forced a government shutdown when last-minute adjustments were needed to secure necessary votes. This more specific response, focusing on particular examples rather than general authority, represented a significant shift from McCarthy's earlier approach. However, Crockett had anticipated this line of argument and was prepared when her next questioning opportunity arrived. Mr. McCarthy, you mentioned the 2018 appropriations cycle as demonstrating problems with review requirements, she noted. However, the congressional calendar shows that the final appropriations package in that cycle was held at the Rules Committee for 5 days, specifically to allow review time. The near shutdown resulted from policy disagreements about border security funding, not procedural transparency requirements. The official Congressional Research Service analysis confirms this timeline. She displayed the CRS report on screen. This suggests the example you provided doesn't actually demonstrate the procedural problems you've described. Could you provide a different specific example where transparency requirements rather than policy disagreements created the governance challenges you mentioned? This correction of McCarthy's historical claim, backed by official documentation rather than personal interpretation, further established the pattern of factual accountability that was defining the hearing. The former speaker appeared momentarily taken aback by the specific rebuttal to his example. The legislative process involves numerous factors working together, McCarthy responded. While policy disagreements were certainly central, the procedural constraints complicated finding timely solutions. Throughout my leadership tenure, I consistently saw how procedural rigidity can exacerbate substantive differences. I understand procedural and substantive factors interact, Crockett acknowledged. I'm trying to identify specific instances where transparency requirements themselves created the problems you're describing. She turned to another document. The Congressional Budget Office actually studied this question after the 2018 cycle. Their report found no statistically significant relationship between review period length and likelihood of successful passage. This empirical analysis seems to contradict your experience-based concern. Were there specific instances not captured in the CBO analysis? This evidence-based challenge to McCarthy's central claim, citing official nonpartisan analysis rather than partisan arguments, continued the pattern of substantive accountability that had characterized Crockett's questioning. Several committee members were now actively engaged, some taking notes on the CBO findings she had referenced. Throughout this portion of the hearing, McCarthy struggled to maintain his earlier authoritative posture. The former speaker, normally fluid and confident, appeared increasingly constrained as his broad claims about procedural problems encountered specific factual challenges supported by institutional documentation. When Representative Scanland was recognized for questioning, she built directly on the foundation Crockett had established. Mr. McCarthy, given the historical record Representative Crockett has outlined showing your previous support for these very reforms, I'm wondering if your current opposition might be influenced by which party is proposing them, rather than their substantive merits. This question, directly addressing the political consistency issue that Crockett had methodically documented, demonstrated how completely the hearing's framework had shifted. McCarthy's response reflected this new reality. I've always approached procedural reforms based on their practical impact, not partisan considerations, he insisted. My perspective evolved through direct experience with the complex realities of congressional budgeting, not political calculations. When questioning returned to Crockett, she took a different approach that surprised many observers. Mr. McCarthy, setting aside the historical record, for a moment, I'm genuinely interested in improving this legislation based on practical experience, she said. Are there specific modifications to these transparency provisions that would address your practical concerns while maintaining the core accountability principles? For instance, would an emergency waiver provision for genuine crisis situations address your implementation concerns? This constructive pivot, offering potential compromise rather than continuing to highlight inconsistencies, created an opening for McCarthy to engage substantively while maintaining his dignity. The former speaker appeared to recognize and appreciate this shift. That's a thoughtful question, Representative Crockett. McCarthy acknowledged, his tone noticeably warmer. An emergency waiver provision properly structured with supermajority requirements to prevent routine abuse could indeed address some practical concerns. Additionally, distinguishing between preliminary discussions and formal negotiations in the disclosure requirements would help balance transparency with necessary deliberative space. This substantive exchange focused on specific improvements, rather than historical contradictions, created a productive dynamic that committee veterans later described as salvaging policy value from what could have remained merely a confrontational moment. Chairman Cole recognized this constructive shift and encouraged its continuation. This kind of specific procedural discussion is exactly what the committee needs to improve legislation. Please continue. Crockett nodded. Building on that distinction between preliminary discussions and formal negotiations, would language defining formal budget negotiation as involving staff from both chambers and the White House address your concern about chilling exploratory conversations, while maintaining transparency for consequential decisions? That definitional approach has merit, McCarthy agreed. The key challenge is crafting language precise enough to provide meaningful transparency without creating procedural landmines that impede necessary governance. Perhaps a tiered disclosure system with different requirements based on negotiation stage and participation level. As this constructive exchange continued, the hearing transformed from confrontational oversight to collaborative improvement. Committee members from both parties engaged in specific discussions about potential amendments, with McCarthy offering technical insights based on his leadership experience and Crockett providing procedural expertise from her background in administrative law. By the hearing's conclusion, what began with McCarthy dismissively referencing Crockett's freshman status had evolved into a substantive discussion of specific procedural improvements, with both participants acknowledged for their respective expertise. The committee had witnessed not just a personal confrontation, but a victory for evidence-based policymaking and institutional accountability. In his closing statement, Chairman Cole acknowledged this transformation. Today's hearing demonstrates the value of combining historical perspective with practical experience. While we began with different views on these reforms, the specific procedural improvements identified through our discussion will strengthen the final legislation. I thank both Representative Crockett and former Speaker McCarthy for their substantive contributions. As members gathered their materials after adjournment, the rare nature of what had transpired was evident in their conversations. A veteran committee staffer was overheard telling a colleague in 15 years staffing this committee, "I've never seen someone so effectively use the institution's own record to hold power accountable without making it personal, even when provoked." For journalists covering the committee, the story had transformed from routine testimony to something far more significant. A congressional correspondent texted her editor, "This wasn't just political theater. We witnessed a freshman member systematically hold a former speaker accountable to his own words, then pivot to substantive improvement rather than personal triumph." That's the congressional accountability process, working exactly as designed. By evening, clips of the exchange between Representative Crockett and former Speaker McCarthy had spread widely across traditional and social media platforms. What caught viewers' attention, however, wasn't merely the personal confrontation, but the substantive contrast between experience-based authority and documented institutional accountability. Washington Post congressional correspondent captured this distinction in an analysis titled "Institutional Memory as Accountability Tool: The Crockett-McCarthy Exchange." The article noted that beyond the personal drama, yesterday's Rules Committee hearing demonstrated the power of institutional documentation to hold leadership accountable across time. Crockett's methodical use of McCarthy's own historical statements transformed what could have been dismissed as partisan questioning into a serious examination of procedural consistency. Political analysts across the past act spectrum acknowledged the significance of the exchange, though they characterized it differently. Conservative commentator Hugh Hewitt observed McCarthy made a tactical error by dismissing Crockett's experience rather than addressing the documented inconsistencies she raised. The lesson isn't ideological but strategic. When confronted with your own words, address them directly rather than attacking the messenger. Progressive analyst Ezra Klein offered a different perspective. What made Crockett's approach so effective wasn't just the gotcha of catching contradictions. It was how she used McCarthy's past statements to explore why his thinking had changed, potentially revealing which arguments were principled and which were convenient. That's accountability that actually advances understanding rather than just scoring points. For McCarthy, the aftermath required careful navigation. His initial response, a tweet thanking the committee for a robust discussion of budget procedures, was widely seen as attempting to normalize what had been an extraordinary accountability moment. This characterization gained little traction as more people watched the full exchange and recognized its exceptional nature. 3 days after the hearing, McCarthy demonstrated political acumen by taking a more direct approach. In an interview on Fox News, he acknowledged, "Representative Crockett certainly did her homework on my previous statements. While I maintain that leadership experience provides essential perspective on procedural reforms, It should have addressed the specific policy evolution more directly. The constructive dialogue we ultimately reached demonstrates how Congress should work across experience levels and party lines. This forthright acknowledgement rather than continued dismissal of Crockett's standing earned McCarthy praise for professionalism. A senior political correspondent noted in acknowledging Crockett's preparation without abandoning his substantive position. McCarthy has transformed what could have been an embarrassing moment into a demonstration of institutional respect. For Crockett, the aftermath brought increased attention to her approach to congressional oversight. Profile pieces highlighted her background in administrative law and her commitment to institutional accountability. The New York Times published an analysis titled, "The Prepared Representative Crockett's Evidence-Based Approach to Oversight," noting that her focus on documented history rather than partisan framing represented an increasingly rare approach in contemporary congressional proceedings. In an interview on MSNBC, Crockett maintained her focus on substance rather than personal vindication. When asked about McCarthy's dismissive comment regarding her freshman status, she redirected, "What matters isn't seniority, but substantive engagement with policy questions." Former Speaker McCarthy and I ultimately had a productive exchange about improving transparency provisions while addressing practical governance concerns. That outcome matters more than any momentary tension during questioning. This response, prioritizing policy improvement over personal triumph, reinforced Crockett's reputation as a substance-focused legislator more interested in institutional effectiveness than partisan advantage. The substantive impact extended beyond personal reputations. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Rules Committee reconvened to mark up the Congressional Budget Transparency Act. The legislation had undergone significant revisions, including several amendments directly resulting from the McCarthy-Crockett exchange. The revised bill incorporated a 3-tier disclosure system for budget negotiations, distinguishing between exploratory discussions, preliminary negotiations, and formal conferences. It also included a carefully structured emergency waiver provision, requiring a supermajority vote for implementation, addressing McCarthy's practical governance concerns while maintaining the core transparency principles. During markup, Chairman Cole acknowledged these improvements' origins. These thoughtful amendments emerged directly from the exchange between Representative Crockett and former Speaker McCarthy. Their willingness to move beyond initial confrontation to substantive collaboration has significantly strengthened this legislation. The amended bill passed committee with bipartisan support, an unusual outcome for procedural reform legislation. Several representatives specifically cited the balanced approach to transparency and governance flexibility as addressing concerns that had previously prevented their support. For congressional procedure experts, this legislative evolution represented something more significant than political compromise. The Congressional Research Service published an analysis noting that the revised transparency provisions represent a rare example of evidence-based procedural reform that incorporates both historical accountability and practical governance considerations. Perhaps most significantly, the Crockett-McCarthy exchange catalyzed a broader conversation about institutional accountability across time. Editorial boards across the country published thoughtful analyses examining how congressional leadership should be held accountable to previous commitments and positions. Representative Crockett's methodical use of historical documentation demonstrated a form of accountability that transcends partisan division, wrote a political scientist in The Atlantic. By focusing on specific statements rather than general characterizations, she established a factual foundation that eventually enabled substantive improvement rather than merely embarrassing contradiction. Months after the confrontation, its impact continued to resonate through congressional procedure. When the House Rules Committee developed new member orientation materials, they included a section on institutional documentation and procedural consistency that incorporated lessons from the Crockett-McCarthy exchange. The materials emphasized the importance of understanding the historical context of procedural reforms and the value of specific documented questioning in committee oversight. For those studying congressional dynamics, the Crockett-McCarthy confrontation and subsequent collaboration became a case study in effective institutional accountability. The Congressional Management Foundation published an analysis titled "From Confrontation to Improvement: The Crockett Model of Oversight and Reform," documenting how evidence-based questioning could lead to substantive policy improvement rather than merely political theater. 3 years later, when another significant procedural reform package reached Congress, the drafting process explicitly incorporated what had become known as the Crockett method. researching the historical positions of key stakeholders before drafting provisions and anticipating practical implementation concerns based on documented experience rather than theoretical objections. For ordinary citizens, the confrontation offered a rare glimpse of how congressional accountability should ideally function. A civic education organization developed a teaching module based on the Crockett-McCarthy exchange, using it to demonstrate how substantive oversight could hold leadership accountable to previous commitments, while ultimately improving legislation rather than simply scoring political points. The lasting legacy of the confrontation wasn't personal victory or defeat, but a model of how institutional accountability could function in a healthy democratic system. In an era often dominated by partisan performance and personal attacks, the Crockett-McCarthy exchange offered a glimpse of substantive oversight focused on policy improvement rather than political advantage. As a senior congressional observer noted 3 years later, what began with a dismissive comment about finding restrooms ended with substantive procedural reforms that actually improved congressional budgeting. That's not just a personal triumph for either participant. It's a victory for the institution of Congress itself when it functions as designed. If you found this analysis valuable, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of today's most important congressional developments. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on how institutional memory can strengthen democratic accountability.